Yeah. Start recording now, Chair. There we are. Good to go.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone to this meeting of the Education and Skills Policy Development Committee on a very windy Wednesday, the 16th of February. Thanks to all of you. Keep warm, keep dry, keep out of the wind, for goodness sake. So can we have any apologies for absence, please?
Yes, Chair. I've had apologies from Bev Hopkins, Mike Lewis and Miles Langston.
Bev, Mike and Miles, lovely. Thank you very much. I should mention at this point, I did ask if Councillor Kerry Evans would be able to attend this meeting as the chairperson of the People Policy Development Committee, and Kerry said he'd give his apologies and apologise. I'll say a little bit more about that now as we move forward. Second item on the agenda is disclosures of personal and prejudicial interest. Do we have any? No. Okay. Now we move on to the minutes of the last meeting. Everyone's had these sent previously by Gareth, so can we go through a page at a time, please? Page 1, page 2, and page 3. So are we content to approve and sign those minutes as a correct record?
I'll move them, Mike.
Thank you, Jan. Seconded.
Happy to, yeah, Lyndon.
Lovely, thank you, Lyndon. Okay, so we're going to move on to item number 4, adverse childhood experiences. And in this context, I know that the People Policy Development Committee previously looked at this and produced a report, I think in January 2019, Framework for an ACEs Informed Organisation. So I invited Kerry, as I said, to attend, but unfortunately he's got a pressing engagement and couldn't come. But we have spoken, and he said that the People PDC had looked at this in some detail. The report they looked at emphasised the overarching and cross-cutting importance of this really important, fundamentally important area of work in a cross-cutting context, right across the entire gamut, if you like, of public service design and delivery. This focused on a general strategic framework, and he was excited by our work, and he will take an active interest in this meeting afterwards, I know, because in the context of education and skills, we have a focus on trauma-informed practice that impacts on kids' ability to learn. And we are, I think it's fair to say, at an important time with the new curriculum for Wales, and we have the opportunity to really look at what we do, how we do it, and how we can utilise best practice as we plan ahead for the future as well. So that's, I wanted just to give a little bit of a background, so we're showing that we're not looking at this in a narrow perspective, we are trying to look at it in a broad perspective and to see all of those holistic links with us as a local authority. So moving on to item number 4 on the agenda. Helen's just disappeared. Oh no, she's back, sorry. I thought I'd better pause. Helen's back, and I think I can welcome Cressy Morgan into the meeting, and Dylan Williams from Park Newry, year 2. Hello Cressy, hello Dylan. Thanks very much for coming along. So can I ask please to for Helen to focus on her report that she's very helpfully put together, that I for one certainly found very helpful and very illuminating. Thank you, Helen.
Oh, thank you. And sorry about that earlier. I just needed to get the dog out of the room because she was snoring considerably. So apologies for that. Yes, thank you, Councillor Dirk. So the report is intended to provide some information on how the Education Department is working to provide support to ensure the cycle of ACEs is broken within Swansea. So just as an overview, adverse childhood experiences are described as traumatic events, particularly in the early childhood, that affect the health and well-being of those who have experienced them. So we know that the effects of ACEs can cause life-limiting problems, which is highlighted in part 1.3 of the report. But it's also important to note that while some children may have experienced ACEs, the effects can be mitigated by an emotionally available adult who can support them through it. So we know that children in Swansea who are vulnerable and have experienced ACEs. So for example, all schools know the children who are looked after within their schools, and all schools know the children who are under child protection protocol, and they have designated staff who are responsible for them. So they're able to intervene to ensure that these children are able to cope in school. But I think it is important to note that ACEs aren't the domain of the less wealthy families. Abuse can happen anywhere, and it's important that school staff have the training to recognise the patterns in behaviour which suggest that there are ACEs present. So if I draw your attention to 1.6, we are seeing the effects of lockdown and the pandemic more and more within schools, and we are aware that it's been classed as an adverse childhood experience in itself. And it is worth noting that while ACEs give us the understanding of what has happened to a child and may explain the reason for the presentation and the responses, our responses as staff and as a local authority to that should be through trauma-informed practices, as you've just said earlier. So if I draw your attention again then to 2.1 of the report, historically our schools have been really swift to respond to our vulnerable learners, as our Estin reports will attest. A very high percentage of schools received the highest outcomes for their response to wellbeing and attitudes to learning, as well as to care, support and guidance. So as a directorate, we have supported this response in many ways. For instance, through close liaison with the ACEs Hub Wales. So we've ensured that all schools are offered free training in ACEs and trauma-informed practices, as noted in 2.4. The new Successful Futures curriculum places emphasis on this health and well-being as a key area of learning. So this training allows schools to identify and support our vulnerable learners appropriately in the preparation for the change. We've also collaborated to ensure the training became available virtually through lockdown, and made it available for school governors and local authority officers. We felt it was important to ensure everyone working with schools understood the problems facing learners and teachers. So in terms of training, we are fortunate to have a close working relationship with our regional staff, and I know Cressy and Dylan are here, who I've known for years and years and years. Cressy, longer than you can care to hope for now, isn't it? And they do provide excellent professional learning opportunities for our school staff, many of which will be discussed today. There is a huge uptake of this training by our schools, and it is very, very well received. And also I'd like to draw attention as well to schools making excellent use of the LAC PDG, which is discussed in more detail in 2.7. So I'd just like to highlight really a strength of the directorate, and I think indeed the local authority as a whole is the ability to work in a multi-agency capacity. So we've built and embedded excellent working relationships with other departments and external services. 2.8 of the report discusses this in detail, and it's just a snapshot of the joint work that is currently being undertaken. So, for example, the Education, Health and Psychological Wellbeing Group, which pulls together health, education and child and family services to provide a coordinated approach to wellbeing. They have been able to advocate for CAMHS outreach workers to be assigned to every school, and that school-based counselling is available at least for the next 3 years. So also I'd just like to highlight the work of the Contextual Missing or Exploited team, known as CMET. They are a team dedicated and experienced in delivering the What Matters conversation for our young people, whilst utilising a contextual approach to safeguarding adolescents from extrafamilial harm. They are supported by a network of agencies who provide specialist intervention bespoke to the needs of the young people involved and identified. The contextual approach means that the team can take support that is needed to the place that matters. So it could be the street corner, it could be a park, or indeed it could be into the school environment. So the approach allows the delivery of formal and informal educative support to the young people whilst working with the adults in that setting to provide safe guardianship, and also consider the impact that physical environment could have on the safety of the young people using it. We've also seen a rise in exclusions, and this is something that we've really seen across Swansea, and we have begun a strategy to reduce exclusions, which is based on prevention and early intervention. The strategy has several strands, which aims to bring together the wellbeing strategies, the contextual strategies and the training opportunities already mentioned, together with opportunities to take a deeper dive into the data, to explore trends and specific target groups. And additionally, as part of the strategy for early intervention, we will be identifying issues that prevent across access to the curriculum, such as language needs and social communication. We've also explored opportunities for off-site educational provision, which is tailored for the need of the child. So points 3.5 and 3.6 identify possibilities of further development in these areas, and the work with the external funding team to explore ways in which these can be funded. So I've given 2 examples of good practice across our Swansea schools, and I do feel a bit guilty really for only providing the 2 schools. It's really unfair, as we could pick best practice from every school in Swansea. So I picked Kevin Hengoyd as an example for secondary school because of the work they're doing within their Chase facility by building up relationships and really looking at these off-site activities to boost the curriculum there. I think it's really important as well with that Chase facility, they place a huge emphasis on relationship building and being emotionally available for the child, listening to the child and taking on board the wishes of the child. And also their work with emotional-based school avoidance. They've taken a deep dive into the issue of non-attendance and come at it in an emotional coaching way. They've really looked at it and spoken to the individual, the parents, and the wider school environment, and they've come up with really innovative ways of dealing with school avoidance. For example, one pupil, they thought that the issues for him, his school avoidance, was the fact that he was dealing with bereavement of a parent. Actually, when they deep dived into what was going on, they found that he was actually having issues just coming onto site, which was easily solved by a member of staff just meeting them at the school gate, being with them, walking onto site, and absolutely fine after that. So it's really easy and useful ways to get a really good response. I've also chosen Plasmal to highlight the fact that they've invested greatly in their staff support so that there is always an emotionally available adult available for the children. They've also invested in a therapy dog, which they call Smarty, who is absolutely wonderful and is able to regulate the children in times of distress. I also want to point out that they've just been awarded trauma-informed status from Trauma-Informed Schools Wales, which is the first in Swansea and only the second in South Wales. And lastly, I just want to draw your attention to the very last point, 3.7. I would be really keen to work with ACE Aware Wales to use their Trace toolkit to eventually become an ACE Aware council. Now, I completely understand that this is a huge undertaking and would have to be broken down, of course. However, I do believe that we're starting from such a good position that we would have a really good opportunity here to be the first council in Wales to be recognised as such. Okay, so I've talked long enough. You've got my report, and on if there are any questions, I'd be really grateful to take them.
Thank you very much, Helen. And I'll ask the committee members if hands up to ask questions about Helen's report as a starting point, and then we move on to Cressy and Dylan then, if that's okay. A couple of points there. Well, first off the bat, I think it's very important for us to acknowledge the success of Plasmal in their accreditation. That is fantastic to see.
Really
it lies beyond my scope to talk about ACE Aware councils, But relating to my opening point, I mean, this should be perhaps something that should be a Wales-wide rollout focus for all public services, not for us to do it in a piecemeal, narrow little way, but something for the Welsh Government to look at right across the country, because it is such an important cross-cutting agenda for all aspects of public services, I think. And I'm thinking of a number of conversations I've had quite recently with colleagues in the police as well, you know, and there are issues there. Can I say, from my point of view, Helen, I've made so many notes on your report, I'm going to lose my way if I'm not careful. For me, there's a process, I think, that we've gone through this year where we've done, I think, a reasonable data deep dive with the benefit of officers, and we've looked at lots of issues as you relate to exclusions included, but looking at data related to vulnerable assessment profiling, and lots of other information as well. When you said that the issues, we're talking about breaking the cycle, and you mentioned that this is not all about less wealthy areas, or less, I can't remember the words you used, but less deprived communities, right? Would you say, though, that we've still got an issue in hotspot, hot topic areas, you know, those issues where we have the higher levels of multiple deprivation, because that's something that we've seen coming through the data, through different data sets this year? Would you say that there's a higher concentration of issues in certain communities over others?
Absolutely. I mean, there are definitely hotspots. I think the point I was trying to make is we mustn't be sort of we mustn't be fixated on the fact that it is only these families that might be experiencing ACEs, you know, and I think all schools should have an open mind as to who could be experiencing adverse childhood experiences. But yes, absolutely, the data does point to hotspots, and that will come out of the strategy to reduce exclusions and the training elements and other areas, like you said. But yeah, absolutely agree. There are hotspots that we do need to work on, and also, interestingly, year groups. There are, interestingly, year groups which are causing a lot of problems. So our CMET team are currently working on year 9 groups. So they're trying to roll out a programme for all of year 9s at the moment. We're seeing a lot of issues with year 9 and year 10. Now, we don't know at the moment whether that is purely down to the pandemic, or whether it's hormones, or whether it's you know, adolescent behaviour, but certainly we are seeing issues in those particular year groups.
That's very interesting. I think there was a Joseph Rowntree Foundation report some years ago now, and one of the highlights in that report across Wales was year 9.
Right.
Critical issues at that stage where we seem to see a bit of a turn in behaviour. Can I go to Councillor Lyndon Jones, please?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Can I say, excellent report, Helen.
Thank you.
Really excellent. I certainly, a couple of things in education scrutiny, we looked at the response of schools to this, and one of the things they were doing differently during COVID, because children obviously not in school, and they were, when teachers were delivering school meals, they used that as an opportunity really to chat to the children, and that was really effective. So they were in touch really, because obviously without that they wouldn't be. And the other thing, we visited Dylan Thomas School, and when you say about that child was a bit nervous to come through into the school gates, the head teacher and staff there met students on the way in, pupils on the way in, to say good morning, great to see you, and all of a sudden that actually improved their attendance at that school quite dramatically. A small thing like that, but it can make all the difference as well. But really good report, Helen. Really interesting.
Oh, thank you so much, Councillor Jones.
And that's exactly what one of the points I was going to make, Lyndon. And I could remember where we were in the school, and we told the deputy head and the head with the fantastic children giving us a tour. And that's the points, that insight, the time, the patience, noticing difference in that, and they were switched on to it there. It was very insightful and very interesting. Councillor Robert Smith.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Can I echo what Councillor Jones said in terms of thank you, Helen, for an excellent report and an excellent presentation. And it does show very well the work that's going on in schools across Swansea. We know this is a big issue with a growing level of need. And I mean, I've always said you can't separate what goes on in school from a child's background and what goes on outside school. And I think, we are addressing and having to address a growing need and increasing range of issues that we're dealing with and our schools are dealing with. So the more support we can give, the better. I'm aware of the issues around year 9 and the exclusions, and we need a coordinated approach that's evidence-based, which is what the approach we are taking. And that, we are genuinely meeting the needs of our young people by doing this. So I think 100% behind you, and I know that the work that's going on across the board in the council to address this and similar issues. So I just want to thank you for bringing it to the committee this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Councillor Jan Curtis.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Helen, for a wonderful report. I'm just going back to Lyndon's comment where the teacher greeted them at the gate. I watched a programme where the teacher either greeted them with a thumbs up, with a hug, or a high five. And I think that goes an awful long way for children to feel that they're appreciated, maybe, and that even if they're naughty, that they're accepted. And yeah, I think that's something that we need to learn, that although kids are naughty, it's not because they're vindictive, it's just they're naturally naughty or whatever. But yet, and going back again to year 9, that's interesting, because I think at that sort of age, they're neither children nor adults. And I think they're a little bit lost in the system, maybe, as to know where they relate to, whether they're relating as a child. People expect them to be adults at that age, and they're not, they're still children. So, that's an interesting thing. And, you see it because, as you know, we've had issues around here, and it's usually that age group that's causing us the problems, unfortunately. But thank you very much for your report. It was very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. And also on that point, I think the pandemic, and schools are saying that the pandemic and the lockdown has caused a lot of these issues. Sometimes you've got, I was speaking to a head teacher the other day who said we've got year 11s running around like they're year 9s. And then, there are lots of other issues as well. So it's really prevented normal development.
And not all children develop at the same stage. Some develop much quicker than others. Some are too old for their age at 3 years of age at the end of the day. But it is difficult, but having been through it myself, I know what it's like to handle blooming youngsters and teenagers, and they don't go away when they're in their 40s, unfortunately.
I don't say that.
They still bring you worries, they bring their wives and their children with them then, unfortunately. Anyway, thank you, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Robert, did you want to come back?
Yeah, just want to go back to that, because I didn't mention it earlier. This whole key stage 3 dip, which I think, the year 9 issue, that's been around for as long as I can remember, and the crucial role that school pastoral systems played in addressing some of those issues. And of course, that's been, because of COVID, that's been taken away, not as strong as it's been. So I think despite the best efforts of our schools, so I think that again is something we need to focus on and make sure that the required support is there.
Definitely, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. My last comment on Helen's excellent insights is for me to do with, you mentioned in the context of Kevin Hencourt, Robert's mentioned it there as pastoral support, and that link is kind of taking the boundaries of the school down and looking at the child in its context. And I think Councillor Des Thomas mentioned previously, we started this kind of focus off, we're talking about it taking a village to raise a child, and that kind of mentality, I think, keeps coming through. The child is not in a vacuum. The child is in a house or a flat at a home with a mum or a dad or carers or grandparents, aunts and uncles, that network around in a community. And I think what keeps coming through very strongly, and did with our focus on sport, health and physical literacy, was that sort of network of support on the child that will act as a springboard to move them on or not. And I think this committee has got to look at the or not category, and that's, I think, what kept coming through. It's great to see the excellent work going on, but one of the key performance indicators that we need to concentrate on to see the wood through the trees, because when Mike Jones, the fantastic Mike Jones in education statistics, but to see all that is how we layer the data And so we can see correlations and similarities and see the child in the numbers, and then say, right, how can we? Great example you gave there of that young boy suffering bereavement, don't want to go to school. How do we put that little, how do we put our arm around him then, you know, metaphorically, to help him move forward? And that's the key challenge. I was thinking about this meeting earlier this afternoon, and that's what keeps coming back to me. It's the practical action to keep young people on track and pointing at the success of the new approach. That's the key thing. And before we move on to Cressy and Dylan, I wanted to say that the experience I had, I've recently become a governor in Dylan Thomas School, right? And lots of links, because I'm a Cocky Board councillor, so I work with the school a lot anyway. And the emotion in the staff team in dealing with vulnerability when we were looking at the curriculum issues and performance of the school quite recently was palpable in the room. The emotional buy-in for those, and we were actually talking about a few young people really, but the buy-in of the team was incredible. And it's tapping in, so it's gone from the stats, it's like thinking with the head and it's going with the heart and finding that targeted approach and making it real so we can point to the success of what we're doing. I think that, but it's a fantastic context to think about, I think. So I can't see anybody indicating to come in at this point now. So can we move to Cressy and Dylan, please? I'm quite conscious we seem to be making an awful lot of use of your time, and I really do thank you for your time and patience, because I keep pestering you every now and then. But thanks both and welcome.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Helen. It was lovely to hear you're going to have that as a sort of set the wider context for Swansea. So, Mike, we do have a presentation. I think I've got powers to share. So, as Helen was talking, I was very conscious that what Helen was giving was a different kind of report, and what Dylan and I would like to present is kind of giving you a sense, really, of the sort of training that we deliver to schools. So the style of what we're going to present would be a similar kind of style to how we deliver training to schools, and I hope it'll go into a little bit more detail around what we mean by adverse childhood experiences and the impact of them. And forgive me if for some of you it seems a bit Helena, you'll be a bit kind of, I know all that, so forgive me if it feels a bit basic in places, but this is the sort of where we go in at in schools. Is that okay?
Actually, can I say, please don't apologise. Assume no prior knowledge for anyone in the committee, and then we will all step together, I'm sure. Perfect. Thank you.
There we are. Okay, so first challenge, sharing screen. Mike, can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Step one. Okay, so thank you, Mike, for inviting Dylan and myself to speak with you today on how Partneria's professional learning offer aligns with the work that Swansea are doing, and Helen's outlined already, around being trauma-informed and therefore responsive to those learners who've experienced significant adversity whilst growing up. So I'm Cressy Morgan, and until the end of this month, I'll continue to be the lead for health and wellbeing in Partneriaeth, and then in a couple of weeks take on my new role as one of the 3 senior strategic leads in Partneriaeth. And presenting with me is my colleague Dylan Williams, who's regional coordinator for the Pupil Development Grant and the brains behind a number of the very important initiatives across the region aimed at tackling inequalities and raising the profile around the need for equity in education. So if we begin just by, and it's repeating actually the same definition you gave, Helen, the definition of ACEs. So they refer to traumatic events or circumstances which happen in childhood which can lead to poorer outcomes across the life course. Helen, it's as if we wrote this together, because the point I wanted to emphasise was that can lead to poorer outcomes across the life course. This is not deterministic, but they can lead to poorer outcomes across the life course. Helen also made the point that adverse childhood experiences are not limited to a sort of a group socioeconomically deprived, and that again links really neatly into what I'd like to just provide you with some information on, which is where the adverse childhood experience profile began, because it actually began with a study into a large group of middle class white professionals in California. So it started back in 1985 and has its origins in an obesity clinic here at the Kaiser Permanente's Department of Preventative Medicine in San Diego, California. And the first ACE study was led by this man, Dr. Vincent Felitti, who ran the obesity clinic. And the clinic was for people who would be classified as chronically obese, so between 100 to 600 pounds overweight. What began to concern Vincent Felitti was the high number of patients who were dropping out of the clinic's program, weight loss program. And what was interesting to him was that these were patients who on paper were succeeding. They were successfully losing weight at the time of dropping out of the program. And being a scientist and someone also sort of committed to improving the health outcomes of these people, he began to explore what this could be about. He looked at all the records of those patients dropping out of the program and discovered from looking through those two things, that all these people have been born at an average normal weight, and that they'd all experienced gradual weight gain over a prolonged period. Oh, none of them, sorry, had experienced weight gain over a prolonged period. But that didn't help him answer why they were dropping out. So what he started to do was interview the patients who dropped out. And according to his kind of memories of the time, he said that he went for weeks with no change. Nothing really came about. And the turning point in his quest for an answer came by accident. He was running through a series of questions with another obesity program patient. And the questions were, how much did you weigh when you were born? How much did you weigh when you started first grade? How much did you weigh when you entered high school? And then the questions changed slightly. How old were you when you became sexually active? And how old were you when you married? And he recalls that he was interviewing a female patient and he misspoke one of the how old were you questions. And instead of asking her, how old were you when you were first sexually active, he asked, how much did you weigh when you were first sexually active? And the patient answered, 40 pounds. And he describes how at that moment he didn't understand what he was hearing. So he asked again, how much did you weigh when you were first sexually active? And she answered, 40 pounds. It was when I was 4 years old, and it was with my father. And that's the moment when Felitti started to look at his patients at the obesity clinic through a different lens. And he begins, and he describes how about 10 days later, a similar conversation was had with another patient. And so it led him to start looking at it through a lens of trauma experienced in childhood. And that's the birth of the first adverse childhood study. So like I said at the start, this is a cohort of around 10,000 adults were surveyed, and the vast majority from white middle-class professional backgrounds. And what he came up with then is the report that's there, the relationship of childhood abuse and household dysfunction to many of the leading causes of death in adults. So he concluded that there was a strong relationship between the breadth of exposure to abuse or household dysfunction during childhood for several of the leading causes of death in adults. And he divided the kind of categories of maltreatment into two. So there was the categories around child maltreatment, which would include persistent, ongoing verbal abuse from a carer. physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, and also the categories which are connected to household dysfunction. So substance abuse within the household, incarceration of a carer, mental health difficulties of a carer, witnessing domestic violence, and parental separation. And when we're talking about parental separation there, we're not talking about harmonious, let's negotiate this and make it work for the kids separation. We're talking about violent, acrimonious separation. And he then went on with his team to map out how these adverse childhood experiences could have an impact over the life course. At the early stages, he identified that adverse childhood experiences in early years could impact and lead to disrupted nervous, hormonal and immune development. It could then impact on social, emotional and learning problems. And then we're sort of hitting the year 9s about here, where we're talking about it can then increase the likelihood of adopting health harming behaviours. An significantly increased likelihood of having non-communicative diseases such as cancer, heart-related illnesses, disability, social problems, low productivity, and early death. Public Health Wales in 2016 carried out 3 pieces of research into the impact of ACEs, and there are 3 reports: the impact on health harming behaviours in the Welsh adult population, the impact on chronic disease and health service use, and then also mental well-being. And in 2017 the ACE support hub was set up in response to these and as part of the focus on adverse childhood experiences. Following the year of the support hub being set up in 2017, a series of really important reports were produced, and this one I just wanted to flag up because it did link to then certainly the way that Helen and I at the time were looking at the work with schools around trauma experienced learners. And that's the report from 2018, Sources of Resilience and Their Moderating Relationships with Harms from Adverse Childhood Experiences. And that emphasised again that ACEs shouldn't be seen as deterministic, that there isn't an inevitable link between ACEs and poor health, social and economic outcomes, but that it emphasised a really key point for education professionals was that having positive relationships and being part of a community like a school where you feel that you belong and that you're an important part of it can significantly reduce the negative impact of ACEs. And it was great to hear those examples that Helen gave of the work at Kevin Hengoyd and Plasmauer. So Kevin Hengoyd clearly recognising the power of supportive, attuned relationships with adults. It's worth, and I'm sure you're already aware of this, but I think it's really interesting that last spring, Julie Morgan led a review of the Adverse Childhood Experiences policy and the work of the ACE Support Hub, and it's very much back on the agenda for Welsh Government. And she sort of makes the point in the forward that COVID has led to an increase in exposure to adversity at the same time as a reduction in access to support. And she goes on to say this potentially is creating a perfect storm, likely to have long-term implications for children's health and well-being across the life course. So clearly something that needs to be a strategic priority for Welsh Government. The key again from this document is that the value of the sort of ACE survey is not at an individual level, but it's at a population level. And it highlights some of the risks of using the ACE questionnaire or an ACE score as a way of sort of determining outcomes, etc. Jumping across to education, and this is the bit that Dylan and I like to hook all our training on, is this extract from Jeremy Miles's forward to the Renew and Reform Education COVID-19 Recovery Plan, and we draw particular attention to the last sentence where Jeremy Miles commits that every decision he makes as minister will be guided by the needs of learners and their well-being, a focus on narrowing educational inequalities and ensuring the best outcomes of all. And at this point, Dylan and I stress that this can only truly be achieved if it's built upon a foundation and understanding of a commitment to equity in education. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Picking up on that point around equity, we use that then and we point to the curriculum for Wales and the guidance, where it states very clearly that the guidance aims to help each school develop its own curriculum, enabling their learners to develop towards the four purposes of the curriculum, the starting point and aspiration for every child and young person in Wales. Again, it's the language of equity. And Dylan and I, Dylan has written and has delivered several sessions on what does it mean when we talk about equity in education, and stressing the point that it's not the same as equality, where everyone is given the same, but equity is about ensuring that those who need more get what they need in order to give them a fair chance to succeed. So that child being met at the school gate was getting that bit more that they needed to get them through the gate. Equality would be, well, you will come in through that door at this time, you will have equal access to school. Equity for that child was somebody noticing what they needed to get them through the school gate. And in terms of ACEs and equity, the starting point, we believe, is supporting practitioners in schools across the region to understand the how and why of the impact that adversity can have on hormonal, nervous and immune development when it occurs in early childhood, and then the ongoing social and emotional learning problems that learners living with ACEs can experience. And we then take them on a little journey through the three types of stress response. So stress can lead to three types of stress response within our nervous systems. The first is what's known as a positive stress response, which is a normal and essential part of healthy development. And it's characterized by brief increases in heart rate and mild elevations in hormone levels. And the kinds of things which might trigger a positive stress response could be having to take a test in school, having to give a presentation, doing something a little bit scary and exciting. All of those we would classify as events which would trigger a positive stress response, a normal and essential part of healthy development. The second type of stress response is what we call the tolerable stress response. And this is the stress response that activates the body's alert systems to a greater degree as a result of more severe, long-lasting difficulties. So we might say experience of illness and then a bereavement might trigger a tolerable stress response. Experiencing a frightening injury could lead to a tolerable stress response. The impact of lockdown and all the disruption that caused, we could describe as something that could trigger a tolerable stress response. The key here, though, is that if the activation of the stress response system is time limited and buffered by positive relationships with supportive adults, that can help the child adapt, and it can ensure that the brain, or support the brain and other organs to recover from what might otherwise be damaging effects. And then the third type of stress response is the toxic stress response. And this is the stress response which can occur when a child experiences strong and frequent and or prolonged adversity without adult support. So prolonged activation of the stress response systems can disrupt the development and other organ systems, and increase the risk for stress-related disease and cognitive impairment well into adult years. Somebody once described the toxic stress response system to me as explaining it that if you experience toxic stress, your body and brain are wired almost like you have a faulty burglar alarm or a faulty fire alarm. So things which somebody without that sort of toxic stress response system on red alert wouldn't even notice, somebody experiencing those levels of toxic stress response would see as danger. So Mike writing now, if I were experiencing a toxic stress response, I would read whatever I can see Mike doing on the screen there is something dangerous and threatening. So underpinning the kind of emotions of a toxic stress response is that sense of fear and a lack of safety. So again, going back to that childhood that was supported through the school gates, the nurturing relationships, that's addressing that kind of fear and sense of danger that children living with toxic stress experience. And then a lot of work's been done on the impact that this has on the brain and development of human organs. And Jack Shonkoff from the Centre of the Dr. Jack Shonkoff from the Centre of the Developing Child at Harvard University concluded from numerous studies that exposure to toxic stress response in early childhood can have the following negative impacts, which when we look at them added together, we can see clearly present as a very significant barrier to engagement in school life and learning. So the first impact it can have is that weakened immune system. So on a very simple term for a school child, that's going to have an impact on attendance. We know as well, because of the impact of the impact of toxic stress can lead to a reduced ability to control moods and emotions. So the child that kind of acts out or just flips and loses their temper can't regulate and manage their emotions. And we know how much of learning kind of relies on being calm and safe. If your brain is wired for danger, you can't access the bit of the brain that needs to be thinking calmly. But very closely related to that is the impact it then has on building positive relationships. So children that struggle to manage their moods and emotions very often struggle to build positive relationships. And what we know from the work we've been doing with Professor Robin Banerjee is the important part that positive relationships plays in the whole learning process. But interestingly as well, it's not just the physical or the social emotional impact. It has an impact on cognition as well. And so Shonkoff's research showed that children exposed to high levels of toxic stress have slower information processing skills and abilities, and very often will have problems with memory and processing. So as I said at the start of this slide, when you add all that together, you're looking at a very significant barrier to learning, social and emotional issues, as well as sort of cognition issues. And at this point, I'm going to share, actually I'm not sharing now, Dylan, you're just going to speak. So Dylan's going to outline now the professional learning offer that we've put in place to support teachers, leaders, support staff in Partneriaeth to better understand some of these challenges. Over to you, Dylan.
Thank you very much, Cressy. Diolch yn fawr iawn am y cyfle I siarad heddi. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As Cressy mentioned, I'll take us quickly through the professional learning that we are delivering at the moment, but also looking to deliver over the next few months. And we'll talk through the various pieces of ACE and trauma-informed professional learning that we have. Looking first at ACEs and the trauma-informed approaches, these sessions provide an introduction to the impact of trauma and the damage that can be caused when a child is overexposed to toxic stress responses. This then links to a development of a session around understanding racial trauma. There's currently a wide discussion happening across Wales about the impact of racial trauma, and we're working with a number of partner organisations to build understanding around this area. Looking then at sensory regulation, often sensory processing difficulties are linked to exposure to early childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences, including the under-stimulation often associated with neglect. Because of the strong relationship between integration of the senses and attachment, it makes sense to look at children with sensory issues through an attachment perspective. Infants who have not developed the necessary language with which to categorise memories by can often have difficulties. However, infants do remember what happens to them in their senses. These sensory memories are imprinted in the automatic system of the brain. The child may then remain activated into a fight or flight response when a sensory system is triggered. For example, if they hear a particular sound or even smell something that reminds them of their early experiences, they may instinctively react as if the trauma were happening all over again. Early trauma and neglect may also mean that a child lacks that all-important nurturing contact or those movement sensory experiences that enable their coordination to develop. We've been working with an organisation called Adenydd, who are based in Swansea, and this is probably one of our most popular sessions. And when we talk about light bulb moments in terms of staff having those light bulb moments in terms of their teaching or their learning in the classroom, an understanding of sensory regulation and actually how many of our children struggle to understand their own regulations and their own emotions and how to self-regulate, this session is very eye-opening. We've already identified the impact that toxic stress can have on social and emotional learning, and we have a range of sessions which can help practitioners understand how to support learners with these skills. One of these is relationship-based play, an approach developed by a trauma expert called Helen Worrell and is adapted from the carer or child relationship building model TheraPlay. Then we also have a session on using sociograms to develop peer-to-peer relationships, where research has shown that trauma experienced learners often struggle to build strong and healthy relationships. This session explores the clear link between positive peer relationships and not only academic outcomes, but also future positive relationships. This is built on the research of Professor Banerjee, who has worked closely with ERU and of course now Partneriaeth for a number of years. Looking then at empathy and emotion coaching. So according to the research of clinical psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen at the University of Cambridge, 98% of people can learn empathy skills. Empathy is seen by many to be a key enabler of other core life skills. And again, we know that trauma experienced learners often struggle with this. Not surprisingly, when we know that empathy is learned and is learned best from an early age in the context of attentive, attuned and responsive caregiving. Considering the two Swansea schools who are leading the way in this area, we have Cadler Primary, who are leading the way on emotion coaching, and Pentre Harvard, who are leading the way on empathy. Finally, we're offering training in poverty proof in the school day, and this is a new edition, looking to raise awareness and understanding of the impact of living with daily stresses caused by economic hardship can have. So what we have there on the screen is a comprehensive list of our training and PL offer around the issue around ACEs and trauma, and this is part of a much larger offer of professional learning around equity and well-being, and we can share that with the group today, and these sessions are open to anybody within Swansea. Back to you, Professor.
Thank you, Dylan. So just to conclude then, if we just recap, I think, on the life course that Felicity and the team drew up. Again, you know, it's not a definite, but you know, it can, the cycle can be broken, but adverse childhood experiences can lead to disrupted nervous, hormonal and immune development, the developmental stage, then the sort of social, emotional and learning problems. So this is the part really that we've been talking about in the professional learning offer, but sort of dipping into the adopting of the health harming behaviours, which is going to sort of kick in around sort of, you know, adolescence and adulthood. We're then if you remember, the clear link then to non-communicative diseases like cancer and heart-related problems, disability, social problems, low productivity, and early death. So it's clear then that there's a real role there for education. But I think it's interesting, and listening to discussions at the beginning of this session, that actually the conversation is about an approach that's not limited to schools, that's actually an approach that's taken on by the entire city and county of Swansea. And that, Mike, is there. Have I stopped sharing?
Yes, you have. No, Cressy, Dylan, thank you very much indeed for what was an excellent, insightful and research-based light into a critical, important area. Some of this felt like some of my lectures. I mean, I lecture at the university and I talk quite a lot about Simon Cohen and about other people related to this field, Philly, and Nadine Burke-Harris. And I think Nadine Burke-Harris in 2019 was appointed as the first Surgeon General for California. And if any committee members want to see a fantastic, impassioned, sleeves-up speech from a leading medical professional, have a look at her talk online, on YouTube, on TED.com. She's a legend. So again, asking committee members if they would show their hands, please, to ask questions here. The finishing point is, I think, very important to be considered. We are talking about a major area, and to try to combine all key partners to think in the same way is challenging. I know that. Do we go back? Do we need to be considering this holistic perspective across health, education, social services, right across the patch? And do we go back to kind of fetal origins? Do we go back to the, health and relationship education, sex education and awareness and all that sort of stuff? Can I give a terrible example, right? One of my younger grandchildren was in special care baby unit. She's 3 now. And when we were in there was a disruptive mum. She was drinking drugs. And the special care baby, and she was allowed to go in and hold the baby. My daughter was there one day. I visited, went home, came back to visit again. And my daughter was upset, and I thought there was something wrong with the baby. It wasn't. This mother had dropped her newborn, 3-pound newborn baby on the floor twice. So fetal origins is a fascinating area here. It's almost, for me, it feels like looking at the DVD of all of our lives and then rewinding and considering the flashpoints where we decided to turn left or right. And doing that for our most vulnerable children. So when we look at Mike's great work and the vulnerable assessment profiling, turning left or right, can we identify those flashpoints and see what support is there? That seems to me to be an important area as we go forward. There's so much research and you do this and then you feel a bit overwhelmed, and I think it's the challenge then about sort of filtering the research into a proactive sort of pipeline of support. Is that what we need to be thinking about, Cressy, Dylan? Do you think, in line with the way that you have filtered this into proactive professional training, is that the kind of thing we need to be considering doing more of, do you think?
I think certainly, just kind of anecdotally, when I had a role similar to Helen's in one of the local authorities in West Wales, what used to strike me and frustrate me, and I'm sure, Helen, you've experienced this, would be seeing a trauma experienced learner in school being managed in a trauma responsive way and then getting in trouble with the police and being dealt with in a way which was wholly inappropriate. Or in a hospital, I remember going to support one of the girls in a hospital and seeing her being spoken to in a way which was, and I think it has to be a wider response, but there's something, I think, Mike, about lots of these things, isn't there, about getting to the essence of what it's about. And sometimes we can overcomplicate, and when we think of the example around Helen saying about, that relationship bit, actually at the core of it is understanding why some people need us to respond to them in a different way. And I think we mentioned it to you before, Mike, that you know, we talk about special needs. It's about special responses. These people just need different responses. And certainly, you know, a book that I've been recommending a lot to teachers on the training is written by Bruce Perry, a trauma expert, and I want to say Whitney Houston, but it's not Whitney Houston. I've completely forgotten her name. Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey. And Bruce, as Brain Freeze, and Bruce Perry, and the book's called What Happened to You? And it's just about shifting the lens of how you look at the presenting behaviour. So you're asking yourself, what's happened to you, rather than why can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant.
And just to link into what Chris was saying there, every element of RPL is about changing mindsets. Nothing we do is about changing the behaviour of the young person in the classroom. Yeah. Everything is about how they are approached, how they are supported, how they are understood. And I think the more we learn about equity, and the more, as I think both Helen and Cressy mentioned, is that equity has to trump equality. Because yes, equality is important in a lot of situations, but actually if we don't give some learners and some adults in other contexts more, then actually we're not going to get to the point where we are able to achieve. And that's something that I think struck us recently, is that all of our PL and all of our support for schools is about how do we support the learner. And that's a mentality. And obviously with ACEs, the more we can understand about what happened to them, as Cressy mentioned, that's the key question. You know, I'm a parent of 2 adopted twin boys, and we had to learn pretty quickly that our approach had to change. We couldn't parent in a way that we had expected to be able to parent. We had to change, and it's those light bulb moments, and you see it happen in the training sessions. You see it happening with schools and teachers, how it just changes the whole dynamic, and that's a powerful thing. And ideally, it would be in every contact across the city, across the country, across the world, where that first contact is, how can I help, or what can I do?
Thanks, Dylan. When you say mindset there, it made me think of a Baltimore senior police officer called Chip Huth, where in the context of tooting, like Western shooting, almost policing, terribly violent, awful drugs, awful crime. And he got to a point and realised, my goodness, if we keep going down this route, we are just complaints, violence, lethal use of force in policing. And he drew a line and said, we need to rethink our mindset. How are we engaging with people? How do we think of our role? Took a massive dose of empathy in a testosterone-filled environment, or you know, RoboCop policing, and transformed Baltimore special weapons approach. It's just incredible by changing the psychological approach to the service. It was powerful. Can I ask Councillor Ross Smith to come in, please?
Yes, I think we've had yet another impressive presentation this afternoon, clearly based on the research evidence, and that is important, that we've got evidence-based policy here, working on what works, and a deep understanding of the issue. I think moving forward, you know, it's clear we need a joined up approach to responding to this. Don't we? You know, we need schools, all practitioners in schools, to be working to the same agenda. And then you gave examples there where that's required, but I think it goes much broader than that, across the whole of, as we said, a whole Swansea approach, and that does require sharing of information, and it requires shared professional development as well, so that we've got this and the consistency of practice. So I think that's going to be the key to this succeeding moving forward.
Brilliant, thank you, Robert. Cressy?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to pick up on something that you said, Dylan, around those light bulb moments, and also just there is a risk, and it goes back to, you know, the review that Julie Morgan led on it, around there's a danger, and I've seen it happen, and Helen, maybe you have, where practitioners become overly concerned about what happened. So when we're talking about what happened to you, we're not talking about, I need to know all the detail of this child's life. it's just that sort of mindset of being inquisitive and wondering. It's not about saying, right, I'm going to do the ACE survey on you, and then we're going to, and some people can get a little bit caught up in that aspect of it. It's more that mindset of being inquisitive around what's stopping you being able to, rather than that, let me do an audit on your ACEs. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you, Cressy. I can't see anybody else indicating at this point. Two things that lasting sort of thoughts in my mind. One is predictability. Predictability, you know, at what stage are these future behaviour patterns evident? And that's a big question in my mind, and very uncomfortable to think that the evidence is there, but do we see it, and do we intervene early enough in an appropriate way? And the other thing, and I'm always going to go back here because of my experience in community work, but community practice and engaging communities in a wider sense, with a discussion about the solutions to their own problems, you know, those challenges and those issues is a challenge and a difficulty. But I think we've done a lot of this in Swansea previously in the context of restorative practice years ago, you know, getting people to think differently about behaviour patterns. And I remember one example in Townhill School where an 8-year-old and 6-year-old had seen their mum and their grandmother arguing ferociously, and the 8-year-old said, "Nan, we don't do things like this anymore." And Debbie, you won't mind me saying, Deb, the school secretary in Townhill, said this afterwards, the day after. She said it was so emotional because mum and Nan went up to school tearful, talking to Debbie, the secretary, and said, "My goodness, we got our 6 and 8-year-olds telling us how to behave." Wonderful example, I think. Yeah, we can change. Councillor Hannah Lawson, please.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I was just wondering whether there is a correlation between the ages that the adverse childhood experiences are experienced and the, how can I put it, the amount of work that has to be done to overcome those, and whether if you're able to kind of intervene earlier in a child's life who's having those experiences, whether you kind of, you can reduce the amount of time that they have to spend overcoming those traumas and those things like the adverse, the toxic reactions.
Yeah, shall I come in, Mike? Yeah, so if you the question about whether it has a different impact at a different age, absolutely, yeah. So what we didn't mention was you can experience adverse childhood experiences in utero, and it will have an impact on the developing brain, which develops from the bottom up with your limbic system, and it will impact on brain architecture. So the younger it happens, the more integrated it becomes in your system, because it will impact on brain architecture and organ development. Which goes back to you know, Dylan's point around the sensory regulation, that a lot of it's sort of pre-verbal. You know, there's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score, which talks about how actually, you know, so you know, your body remembers stuff before you can actually remember it. So very definitely that those sort of early, and so for you know, Dylan mentioned his own boys there, their experiences, pre-birth experiences, you know, I don't want to speak for your boys, Dylan, but I'm speaking for my niece here, who I know that her pre-birth experiences have affected her brain architecture, and it does mean that she needs a different kind of response around certain things.
Thanks, Cressy. Yeah, and I think that some researchers talk about this as a series of triggers. So the growing fetus, and once those triggers are switched, the damage is done. You know, we can have to heal and cope and learn, but that could lead to heart disease when you're 50, it'll certainly affect your learning capacity. So school readiness goes through the floor in the most traumatic in utero experiences. Smoking too much, chaotic lifestyles, drinking too much, partying every weekend, all this sort of stuff really affects the growing fetus. And I said some researchers have gone back before that to say, look, we can predict the future health of the child before it's conceived. Ellen Key in 1900 was talking about the first right of every child to pick its own parents wisely. Of course, the child can't, but we can. That was her genius insight, Dylan, please.
Yeah, another session that we do offer as part of our PL is linked into FASD Cymru, so Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Cymru. And actually, I also do a lot of work with Adoption UK Cymru, so obviously in terms of supporting adopted children and learners. And there is a belief that in the next 5 to 10 years, the biggest conversation we'll be having about young people is fetal alcohol, and actually the impact that has, and actually whether, because it was widely believed they're affecting between 5 and 10%, it's believed that actually it may be affecting 35 to 40% of the population, and in terms of what that alcohol does to the brain, and actually how the development from that, everything from that, as Mike mentioned earlier, in terms of those trigger points, or those looking left or looking right, once that's in, then it becomes much harder to even consider supporting, because it is a life-limiting illness or condition. So yes, it's interesting in terms of the levels and whether this is something that affects different ages. I suppose every individual is individual, and it depends on what's happened to them and the impact. But I suppose the more positive thing is that you only need one positive relationship. One positive relationship can change directions, and that's something that we sometimes don't focus enough on. And actually that might be in school, that might be that one teacher who supported you, who cared about you, who listened to you. And you may have seen there was a Steve Wright video where he saw the teacher that was kind to him, and he was just so happy to see him again. If you haven't seen that, I could share that, because that's a powerful...
Ian Wright, footballer, Dylan, is it?
Right, that's Steve Wright.
I see.
Yeah, a powerful kind of piece. But there was one teacher in school who believed in him, and that's all it needed, really. And that's a powerful, I suppose, visual.
Brilliant, thank you, Dylan. I think please put your hands up, indicate if there's any final comments from anyone in the committee here. But I think I think it was December, I'm not sure, but I think there was a report that we had a 300% increase in autistic spectrum disorders in the last 7 years. Something like that was reported. So I think maybe that links into your comments there about the fetal alcohol issues and wider issues perhaps that we are facing, and the year 9 question mark and the behaviour patterns and everything else coming together. Hannah.
Yeah, sorry. I just had one more question, if that's okay. I was really interested by what you were saying about sensory memories compared to language-based memories. And I think that seems to me like a really important point. And I was wondering if when you are able to help children develop their language skills and their ability to use language to describe things rather than react in a sensory way, whether that is a way of helping them to kind of get to grips with their experiences and to kind of heal from that. Would I be right in thinking that is one area of work that can help with children who've had these experiences?
Yeah, do you want me to come in, Mike?
Yes, please, Dylan.
Yeah. I think I would. What I could do, I can share the session that is scheduled for the next few months with Dennis. A fantastic session over 2 or 3 hour sessions over 2 days, where they explore sensory and actually what it feels like and looks like, and actually the impact that it can have. I mean, we've seen stories of children who, up to a certain age, literally cannot speak about their emotions, cannot speak about how they feel or what they're feeling, and that once an element of work is done or an element of support is provided, that almost the floodgates open, because actually there is the ability to then understand that I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling hot, I'm feeling cross, as I say, with my own children, and that's a verbal conversation that we have. And then obviously linking back to that sensory is that the problem we often find is in early years, if children have sensory regulation difficulties, is they aren't able to explain why they've hit their friend, or why they've pushed the teacher, or why they've thrown the chair across the classroom. But as those children then grow up with the right level of support, you'd hope that they are then able to explain, well, actually that teacher looked at me in the wrong way, or something's happening at home. And again, it becomes about that emotional. In Swansea, you have the Exchange, which do a lot of excellent work with the schools in terms of that resilience building. And sometimes there is no easy fix. Very often it's not a quick fix solution for a large number of our learners. It is a bit by bit piecemeal approach where it's just constant support. And again, I talk a lot about my own children because they are my point of reference, and it's a powerful thing for me that they're 10 now almost, and they've been going through intensive therapy with psychotherapists, and actually the difference in their emotional vocabulary, because they have someone to talk to and have somebody to really kind of raise those questions with, is immense. And actually, they both had sensory issues that always have from very early age. They are subsiding now. They potentially might never go, and that's something we've been told to be aware of. But it's a very powerful tool. It's just that talking and that ability to understand why this is happening. So I think Helen mentioned the school-based counsellors. Things like Thrive, which the city is invested in, are all so important and so powerful, because that social and emotional understanding and ability to understand is powerful on both the teacher and the adults perspective, but also the learner, and obviously them understanding their own sensory issues as well.
That's again, as Cabinet Member Councillor Robert Smith said, a brilliant meeting supported by excellence and insight, I think, really. And I just had a message from Helen Morgan-Rees, who said that she'd had to leave to cope with severe weather protocols for schools. No surprises, because there's quite a blinking gale out there, so she's had to leave. She's sent off an apology. I don't work for this person and I don't get commission, but can I just point out the Toxic Child Distress by Nadine Burke-Harris, right? And the book says Toxic Child Distress, the legacy of early trauma and how to heal, right? And that's the key thing. I mean, whenever we talk about these issues, it feels bleak, doesn't it? And you talk about people, some of us might have had early trauma in our childhood, lots of us perhaps did in one way or another. But there's a way forward. If we identify the issue, if we can intervene and we can support them, we can transform those lives. And we've heard from Helen at the beginning of the meeting, the great work. And you apologised, Helen, to say I'm only giving you a couple of examples here. If we asked Dylan about an overview of Swansea schools, or Helen in the PDG context, we'd be, oh my goodness, and we've seen this through Lyndon's committee in scrutiny. We've gone out and experienced, we have people coming into us, and in this committee we keep seeing this. So can I, even though these things are difficult to talk about, the proactive approach that we see in Swansea, for me, certainly is really encouraging and breathtaking. It's great to see. I feel a bit, emotional myself, if I'm honest. So I can't see anyone else indicating now. So can we move on to the work plan, item 5 on the agenda, and we are coming to towards the end of the municipal year, and looking back at what we've done is really quite impressive, I think, over time. Next time we've got the 16th of March, we've got to focus on outdoor education. And then I think, Robert, I think we'll be in the process then of kind of drawing things together and considering, concluding and summarising and writing up a report, which is going to come with its own challenges, I think, because there's a lot of work here. So on that moment, no other people indicating here, can I thank the committee for, again, enthusiasm and insight, brilliant reports. Presented by Helen, Cressy and Dylan, and I know we've all, and I can see by expressions on the screen how enthralled people were with this very, very important area of public policy. And on that point, can I thank you for your enthusiasm and call the meeting to a close. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.